Hello and welcome back to Ask Motoring. I have a bunch of very interesting questions today as usual, and that is thanks to the motoring community, which has both the questions and a whole bunch of answers. If you'd like to know where to find these questions and answers, come to Circles on the MotorInc app. You should also be able to see them on the MotorInc website, and there you'll look for the hashtag AskMotoring and you'll discover a plethora of questions about buying new vehicles, about keeping up with new vehicles, about riding gear, riding technique, driving technique, and so much more. Every week, Karthik and I go through the Circle section. We find some of the more interesting questions and we bring them up here onto this episode. Here's Mayank. Mayank owns a Bike riding denim for daily commutes, and yesterday he managed to get it stuck in the grab rail of his Generation 3 Duke 390 and it basically got torn. And his question is, are they structurally sound anymore? Could the Kevlar have been damaged? And should he be replacing the stock grab rail with something that's not quite as sharp and still provides the practicality? The third part of the question is the easiest answer, which is if you think it's going to be a problem, you should. But honestly, the number of people who've said they've managed to get clothing stuck on the grab rail of the Duke 390, honestly, it's not too many people. There is a sort of edge there. So in theory, it could happen. There are two kinds of denims. If the Kevlar thread is inbuilt in the denim and the denim has gotten torn, Kevlar, Cordura, whatever it is, then yes, it has definitely been damaged. If there is a Kevlar lining, which can usually make this denim more heavy, more bulky, and quite a bit warmer to ride with, then you will see the damage because the Kevlar usually is a yellow colored lining that happens to be on the inside of the denim. Depending on the quality of the denim, it'll either have a comfort liner on the inside, which sort of looks like the inside of your jacket, or it will be naked, which has also happened to one of my riding denims, which honestly I didn't use a lot of. Now, should he get it repaired or not? The first people to ask this question is Bike themselves. They make the garment and they will be aware of where the structural strength comes from and in how many ways the damage that your denim has taken will compromise its ability to do its job next. My default baseline, absolute basic, is if I can't trust a piece of safety equipment, I must immediately have the courage, let's call it, to say, okay, I cannot use this anymore. I must replace it no matter what the expense is how I work my riding gear. But I remember I fell off my bike. I was wearing an RI helmet and it seemed to have a glancing impact that basically broke the vent. It didn't really damage the shell. And I was in two minds about what to do. I sent the photograph to RI and they responded saying, based on these photographs, there's absolutely no damage to the helmet at all. You're just going to need to buy a new vent and here is the part for that vent in the color that my helmet was, etc. So to me, first step, please take pictures. You haven't put pictures here, so I can't comment on what this denim looks like. But I would say take these pictures, write to Bike customer service and say, this is what has happened to my denim. Is it repairable or is it something that needs to be replaced? In my experience, if you've managed to split a seam in the process, it might actually be repairable, assuming that the tailor understands that the seam is a part of the structural strength of the garment so that when you fall, it shouldn't burst open, which means if there were two seams originally, sometimes three, then he has to make sure he stitches the overlapped material 3 times. However, if the material has ripped in the middle of a panel, let's say across the top of your thigh was where this denim was, and it ripped across the middle of it, although I'm assuming it probably happened at your calf because that's how the leg goes over the bike. If a panel has ripped, then repairing it and making it structurally sound, it can be quite difficult unless you have more of the same material, which you can make sure overlaps the torn part, and the new patch is what gives the structural strength. Bike will have the final answer, but to me, if the back of your calf muscle, for example, is where the denim is torn, a taller boot might cover that area and it may not be such an issue anymore. But if you're in any doubt at all, you're going to need a new garment. The next question is from Dr. Maverick, who is asking if there are any updates in the electric family two-wheeler space because it's been a year since the Rizta, more than that for the iQube and Chetak. Which one to buy? This is not for him, it's for his father who is in the late 40s. Alternative, Glamour X, Pulsar 125, Hornet 125. Dad is not really interested in a higher capacity motorcycle. Main priority will be mileage, and he's saying his default would be to tell him to get a TVS Sport, which gives 90 plus kilometers per liter and happens to be one of the least expensive motorcycles to purchase. Brand is not the issue because most of these showrooms and service centers are not very far from where he lives. The answer, Dr. Maverick, is that I would not buy an electric vehicle based on how new it is or how updated it is, because this is a space with emerging technology, and since your dad is going to use it, who's not really interested in the latest features and and the maximum range, etc. You just want something easy, stable, and secure to live with. I would actually be very happy about the fact that the Rista is a year old and the iQube and the Chetak are even older, because it means these have been on the market for a long time. The initial glitches, if any, have been worked out, and we've been through this process. And what you're going to buy, Rista, iQube, or Chetak, is going to be a reasonably stable product. Between the three, they are very different propositions. The Rista will come across as the most sophisticated of the three. The iQube will probably be the most comfortable of the three, and the Chetak sits somewhere in the middle of both, but it looks the best of the three in terms of overall finish and quality. This is how I would slice and dice this to make sure that your dad gets the right product. To me, do involve your dad in this decision. From what you're telling me, an electric will work out just fine for dad. There is no reason for you to look at the ICE motorcycles you've listed at all, but do let him pick, because in this group, I don't think there's a truly terrible product. I give you the downsides also. The Rista is probably going to be a little bit more expensive than the other two. The iQube can become a little bit bouncier when it gets to higher speeds, which your dad is unlikely to do. And the Chetak, it still has a trailing link type front suspension, which can make it a little bit more jerky when it goes over bad roads versus the other two. These are the downsides. Pick any one of these three. You're going to end up with a nice, stable, slow-moving, efficient electric that dad's going to enjoy. Simple. The next question is a very long question. It's from Suscat69, which should tell you how young this person is. No, I shouldn't be judging people. Okay, we won't judge him. He's a third-year college student C who's buying his first ever motorcycle, and he's confused. He was looking at a Domina 400. None of them had displays or test drives. He's now attracted to the Duke 250 and the 390, and he's thinking that he'll outgrow the 250 quickly. The 390 is slightly higher on the budget, but it's super aggressive for a beginner. He's aware of this. He's been riding his 8th of 450 for 2 to 3 years. He's only occasionally ridden geared bikes. Then he thought of the CB350, and then he's feeling like that's slightly outdated, and he's back to considering the Duke, and he's saying he's not really into adventure bikes, and he's not really into Royal Enfield either. He intends to ride 400-500 kilometers a month. He's looking to finance it, paying up to ₹1,00,000 in the down payment depending on the price, expecting to have an EMI of 10,000 rupees per month. He's 5'9", 70 kilos. This will be his first bike. He's from Bengaluru. What do we say? Answer actually is a good one, which is D. Rathul, who is saying, please take a test ride of the Triumph T4. And that's what I would tell you to do. I see a lot of preconceived notions here, given the fact that you're just buying your first motorcycle. You were saying, I'm not into ADVs. I'm asking, how do you know you're not into ADVs? You've never ridden one. You're saying you're not into Royal Enfield. I'm saying, how do you know you're not into Royal Enfield? You haven't had one, etc. I'm saying, get rid of these things. Go get a few test rides. This database that you're trying to establish to say, I like this and I don't like this, it'll become a little bit more well-informed. Even if the motorcycles turned out to be, yeah, I knew that I would not like this, even that is more confirmed information than what you have right now. As far as the 390 Duke goes, to me, the 390 Duke feels so light, so friendly, and goes so fast and is so sharp that a new rider thinking that they're going to somehow learn the process of dealing with this motorcycle and become used to it in time, it's going to be the exception, not the rule. The only way that I would say, let's say that you do want the 390, let's say the budget is no longer the issue and you want to get a 390, there's only one way to do this as far as I'm concerned. Buy the motorcycle, stick it in rain mode, and make sure that you do not exit rain mode for any reason at all for at least the first, let's call it 12 months, while you get used to how sharp the chassis is. Once you're used to how sharp the chassis is, then from rain mode, go to street mode so that the motorcycle has full performance again, but it is not going to surprise you when you open the throttle. There is some amount of latitude before it starts to react to what you want. And if you persistently learn to concentrate, to focus, to anticipate, work on your skills, and maybe a year from now, when you finally get into the full performance mode of this motorcycle, which is chassis, which is engine, which is all the feelings coming together, maybe it won't overwhelm you. Next is a long question from Sayantan, and the summary of the question is, he was riding a adventure motorcycle. He had to go off-road because there was a diversion of some sort. He came to a mound in the road which sort of looked like a speed breaker made of dirt, but when he came over that, there was a ditch on the other side which he fell into. He was wearing gear, not a lot of damage. The bike was not too badly damaged either, as far as I can tell, but it's caused a huge dent in his confidence, and he's looking for help. And the answer, Sayantan, is the simplest thing ever. You cannot ride faster than you can see. And in this particular case, two things combined. One, you made an assumption that something that looked like a mound in the road was probably a locally made speed breaker. A. B, you accelerated into a space where you couldn't see the other side of the speed breaker, which happened to be a ditch. The rule for this is very clear. 100% commitment is only possible if you're in an off-road situation at a track of some sort, or in a road situation if you're at a racetrack of some sort. There is no other situation where 100% commitment works. 100% commitment being, I'm using all the braking that I'm capable of using. That's either your limit has been achieved or your motorcycle's limit has been achieved. I'm using all the acceleration available. I'm using all the turning grip available, etc., etc. This only happens off the public road. There is no way to do this on a public road. This should be a baseline. This is non-negotiable. Next, if you know a road really well, for example, the road that you commute on, then you can commit more than you normally would. And to me, on a public road, this is still 50% of what is possible. But I'm saying I know this road. I know where the speed breakers are. I know where the dust accumulates. I know where the weird traffic patterns are. I know where the hazardous intersections are. Because I know so much about this road, because I use it so often, I can ride a little bit closer to the edge of what I think is okay on a public road, which again, maybe as far as 50% of far away from what is actually possible in that situation. When you go to unknown roads though, then the game flips to what can you see and how do you ride so that you stay within what you see. Think about it as the same situation as you're familiar with this road, you've only used it in the day, but today you have to ride it in the night. As soon as you come to the night, the traffic pattern changes, your headlight defines what you can see, and therefore the hazards can look like they are fewer, but inside you know that there are hazards there that I can't see anymore, and that slows the pace down if you're a good rider, and it makes you become a lot more cautious, you pay a lot more attention. That does allow you to ride smoothly, but it may not be at the same pace anymore. When I ride an unknown road, I don't have issues like this primarily because if I see a mound across the road, my first reaction is not to try and classify it, but to see what's on the other side of it, precisely for the reason that you just said. There was not supposed to be this detour. There's not supposed to be a mound of earth in the middle of the road. What's going on? Let me slow down. Let me make sure that I know what's going on before we go. This is the exact same reason why all the off-road guys will tell you, when you see a water crossing, even if the stream looks shallow, you come, you park, you double check and make sure that it is as shallow as you think it is, and then you go across. And if you're in doubt, you leave the bike on the side, you walk into the water, you make sure everything underneath the water is as you expect it to be, then you commit to riding that stretch. The basic riding error that you've had, and this is not a hard fix and this is not an uncommon error, is you assumed a classification for the world that happened to not be the real case. That's all. So to me, the amount of commitment that you bring to riding changes based on the situation. If you're an unknown situation like this, the commitment level has to be really low, and the let's make sure it is what I think it is has to be much higher. Your last case, worst case scenario, and that is you have to stop the bike, walk up to it and say, oh, okay, so that's not a speed breaker, and oh, there's a ditch on the other side. That's how it works. As far as confidence, get back on it, start riding. Ride in places and paces that make you confident, and your confidence will come back. This is not a big deal. And the last question is from, oh, I love that, Yamaha. And it's a riding technique question. He's trying to be a better rider. He wants to practice the right technique. And his question is about the hand position on the clutch and brake. How many fingers should you use on the clutch? Using 2 doesn't press it halfway. The other fingers get in the way. And using 4 can lead to a panic squeeze while braking. For the front brakes, he typically has his thumb and index finger in a circle around the throttle, 2 fingers on the brake. And he's been practicing to hold it at the biting point in city traffic. Is he doing it right? And the answer is not really. Your hand should have 5 fingers. Some humans have 6. Out of these 5 fingers, these 2 are the ones that we can control with the most precision. So these go over the clutch and the brake lever. The thumb hooks around the handlebar, so it's not possible for the hand to get slipped off the handlebar by mistake or a bump or whatever. And these 2 effectively function as a hook that holds it in place. So if you want to think about it, I make a circle with these 3 fingers so that my grip cannot be loosened, and I operate the levers using these 2. There is almost no exception to this. If you stand up and ride off-road, where more delicacy is required rather than force, often, most riders, including myself, we will now take 1 more finger off the brake and clutch lever, and we will be on top of the motorcycle with our hands down on the handlebar with just 1 finger operating the clutch and the brake. The reason why you're struggling with your clutch is because your clutch is not adjusted enough. What you want to do is move the friction point of the clutch far enough away so that when you pull the clutch in, so let's say this is the lever, when you pull the clutch in, it doesn't pinch your other two fingers. If it is just above the fingers or just touching the fingers, whatever you're comfortable with is good enough. But if you're having to get your fingers out of the way, it's not a finger issue. Your clutch is not adjusted correctly. You can do it yourself. It's pretty simple. You can look up the technique on YouTube, or you can ask a mechanic to do it. It's literally like a 15-second job, not a big deal. As far as the brakes go, using a random number of fingers on the brakes is a pretty common early rider issue. It's not a sustained issue. It's not that big a deal, but I think you will take a moment to adjust to the idea, saying, I hold the handlebar with these three fingers and I operate the brake with this. But it has to be consciously worked at until you're doing this. And you don't hold the brake lever against the biting point, because that means the hydraulic system is always generating some amount of pressure. That's not a good thing. You're going to wear out your brake pads early. What I like to do is adjust the brake lever or my finger position, depending on what the equipment on the motorcycle is, so that my finger basically rests on top of the brake lever. I have found that when I do this, which is technically the better thing to do, sometimes when I'm riding in a slightly busy situation, I can start pulling on the brake lever as you're doing right now without realizing it. So I find it safer to let my fingers sit on top of the brake lever, so that when I'm closing the throttle, so let's say this is the open throttle position, as I'm closing the throttle, my fingers naturally fall in front of the brake, and that means I'm not pulling the brake constantly, but I'm right there when I need to be. So I would tell you, your clutch, first adjust it, and then you should be able to keep these two fingers securely on the handlebar grip while operating the clutch fully. The other side, change your riding position in terms of your hand. It will take you a few rides to get used to this new riding position and the change of feel and feedback from the brake, etc. But this is the right way to do it. Start out by having your fingers in front of the brake if that's more comfortable. But what you're working towards is having your fingers sitting on top of the brake lever when the throttle is open, so that when you close the throttle, your finger naturally goes to the front of the brake lever. Thank you so much. That's all we have on this episode of Ask Motoring. If we've caused you to have questions of your own, please do come to Circles. Use the hashtag AskMotoring and leave us your question. You'll find an intelligent, warm, and helpful community who will give you their best answers. And of course, we are there to back them up, to expand the answers when needed, and to say, okay, that is a good idea, but it works better if you tried something like this. The most interesting of the questions, they come up here on Ask Motoring. Karthikeya will have his own set next week. Until then, Ask Motoring. See you.